get a sense, or at least from the last symposium, I get a sense how well or how far it's going. If after the break, how many people return on that, and just not everyone will return. So it's a good sign and pressure from Dr. Shirk, right, on that. But I introduced them prior to June to speak, and so I won't do that again. But what I would encourage you, like you did with June, as Dr. Shirk is closing out his presentation, is please ask those questions. You get the opportunity to speak to someone that may provide a perspective that's a little bit different and has been developed through, especially his extensive research and travels into Mexico and other Latin American countries. With that, Dr. Shirk.
Perfect. Is this a real laser? Watch your eyes. Well, thank you, Victor, for that warm introduction, and more importantly, thank you for the opportunity to be here. It's really a pleasure to be at the Center for Law and Social Behavior. It's a great pleasure to be back here at UTEP. I want to thank Victor, and I also want to thank Leonora Martinez Ortega, who did all of the logistical preparations to put on such a fantastic event. This is one of the best organized conferences that I've participated in a long time. There was a tremendous amount of coordination that was involved, and to bring all of us here together, and so I'm really excited about that, and I want to acknowledge the excellent work that Victor and Leonora did. I also want to acknowledge the really excellent presentation by June on this topic. I'm basically just going to take questions because she covered everything. I have a couple of slides, about 150 slides, so I'll just go through those real fast, and then I'll do my presentation. But June is really it's such a resource. She is clearly one of the most important experts in the country on transnational crime and transnational organization, particularly with regard to Mexico and Latin America. And it is June that our nation's leaders turn to for answers about the problems that many of you are working on every day. If only they would listen, and if only they would act, I think we would make a lot more progress than we have in the last few years, and the unfortunate result of not seeing more progress, as I'll talk about, is an astounding toll of human life and lives shattered. So I think it's important to underscore the real importance of the work that June does, and the great importance of the work that all of you are here to do. Vic told me that we have participants from 25 different law enforcement agencies, including DHS, ATF, DEA, FBI. We have DOD here, El Paso PD, Sheriff's Department. We have the El Paso Community College Police, this Harbor City Police. We have folks from EPIC that I've gotten to speak to, and you're an impressive group of people who have dedicated their lives to trying to make our community safer, and I want to acknowledge and thank you for being here and for listening to me. You guys are really the experts, and the collective amount of wisdom in this room, I think, is fantastic. So again, I'll try to get through those 150 slides as quickly as I can so that we can really have a conversation. It's been a long time since I've been in El Paso. I started to come here soon after the violence, around 2008, 2009. I started coming here for various forums. I came to a couple of conferences here at UTEP that were organized by some of my academic colleagues. I came back in 2010 as part of a study group that was sponsored by the Wilson Center and the University of Wilson Center in Washington, D.C., and the University of San Diego. We sent a group of about, I guess it was 10 of us here to try to understand what was happening in the violence. And we got here, I think it was in March 2010. We met a colleague of mine, Alfredo Corchado, a reporter who's joining us here for an opportunity to spend a week in El Paso, Juarez to try to understand what was happening. And the night before we arrived, there was unfortunately a horrible massacre. Many of you are familiar with the Salvar Car massacre. 15 people died, 13 kids, 2 adults, at a birthday party. And that was my welcome to El Paso and Ciudad Juarez in 2010. In 2000, but that, I mean, it was a fortuitous, not a fortunate, but a fortuitous circumstance insofar as we got to see the response of public authorities. We got to talk to law enforcement as this crisis was unfolding, and really get a sense, and even talk to the families that were affected, and really get an on-the-ground view of what was happening and the implications of this violence in one of the most important and most tragic incidents in a long series of tragic events that basically have comprised the drug war as we've seen it over the last 10 years in Mexico. That was 2010, and as Alfredo remembers, I had a lot more hair at that time. I had long, big afro back then, and no gray hairs. So it's been a long time. A lot has transpired, and what I'm going to try to talk about today is how some of these patterns, some of these trends have played out over the last decade, and I'm going to make reference to some of the work that we've done recently. I'm going to talk about some of our recent publications because I think it would be useful to some of you in law enforcement that want to take a deeper dive in some of this material and look at some of the publications we've put out. I'm going to talk about the long-term trends as regards specifically to homicide. I'll bring up a couple of other types of crime and talk about the trends that are occurring there. But my main focus for the last decade really has been looking at why people die before they should in Mexico. The number one reason is homicide, at least for young men, primarily between the ages of 18 to 35. And it is, particularly for those at the lower end of the socioeconomic spectrum, the number one leading cause of death, and it shouldn't be. I want to talk specifically also about the role of organized crime in Mexico's violence. June's really given us an excellent overview of the various groups and the dynamics between those groups and how that's played in. I want to underscore a couple of points related to that and hopefully try to answer some of the questions that came up along the way. There were some really excellent questions in the first session about the sort of origins of some of these groups, the groups from Sinaloa and so on. And I want to try to address those as best I can. If I don't get to it, hopefully we can talk about that in the Q&A. I'll end with some of the policy recommendations that have come out of our publications that we've done over the years. Many of the policy recommendations haven't changed because, frankly, our strategies haven't changed, and some of the things that we haven't been doing well, we're replicating and continuing to do, and we need, I think, ultimately to really change the way we're doing what we're doing. So I'll start out by just mentioning every year for the past 9 years, we've put out a report called Drug Violence in Mexico. This was a publication that I started when I was on my last sabbatical at the Wilson Center in Washington, and I had no idea we would be doing this for a decade. I thought it was a one-off, and we wound up doing it every year since. This is a fairly comprehensive look at the available data, and the data have improved over the last 10 years, but there's still a lot of challenges with trying to do the analysis of the data on homicide in Mexico, and I'll talk about some of those. But we've been trying to look at what are the trends, what are the data available on homicide, and what can we learn from that. This is a report that I co-authored with my colleagues at the University of San Diego in the Justice in Mexico program, Laura Calderon, who's a graduate of our Master's in International Relations program, which I also direct, and my colleague and Mexican attorney, he's not my Mexican attorney, he's a Mexican attorney, I'm one of 3 clients of another attorney that I won't mention. Not right now. Just bad joke, sorry. Sorry, Mike. Octavio Rodriguez Ferreira, who's a fantastic researcher and attorney who works with us and heads up coordinates our program. The other, so the main findings of that report, which just came out last month, basically are a deep dive and analysis of the available statistics on violence in Mexico. And the big headline that we've been seeing for several weeks and even since late 2017 is that 2017 we saw a record number of homicides in Mexico, over 28,000, close to 29,000, and that's a 27% increase in the number of people killed in Mexico. That's thousands of people killed more this year than last year. By our estimates in this report, we try to tease out, what proportion of these homicides were homicides that had signs of organized crime involvement. Now, that's a problematic distinction for lots of reasons, which I can go into in more detail. But if you're using an AK-47, if you have multiple victims or multiple assailants, if you have written on the victim in some way with a sign or with a knife, if you've written "I am a drug trafficker," if there was some other indication of drugs involved, a large shipment of drugs involved, etc. These are telltale signs, right, that organized crime was involved. It could be a very, very clever husband who is, trying to, make it look like it was the drug traffickers, but it meant so many of these cases. I mean, we look at, we look at newspaper reports. We try to corroborate the cases that we're looking at, and there are a number of organizations that do this. There's a pretty good, there are often pretty good indications that these were not interpersonal disputes by family members. They're not intrafamilial violence. So it is really, I think, important to try to track those. And the other main finding, which June mentioned, which I think is really important to underscore, is the way that the changing landscape among organized crime groups, particularly the fall of Chapo Guzman, has contributed to greater competition and violence as their sort of organizations are now jockeying for control of territories that he formerly operated and or the remnants of his organization are trying to remain in control of. So we'll talk more in detail about how that's played out over the remainder of the talk. I do want to point out a couple of other themes that we've touched on in the last few months in some of our reports. And I do have to apologize. This slide and I think 2 other slides are bonus slides that I've added since Vic was able to print these out. So I don't think these are on the test. I don't think these are on the exam, so you can just zone out for right now. But if you're interested, in the last few months, we have tried to take a close look at a couple of important topics. First is the resurgence of violence in Tijuana. Last year, Tijuana was Mexico's most violent city. For the first time since, I think, 2007. And so we wanted to look at why that has been the case. What are the dynamics of violence in Tijuana? And why did we suddenly see this increase? I'll talk a little bit about that here, but spoiler alert, 4 letters, C, J, and G. Okay? And that's why we did a separate report entirely focused on the new generation cartel. Which is the fastest growing, as June mentioned, and arguably the most dangerous threat in terms of Mexican public security at this moment. I won't be able to go into a whole lot of detail on the evolution of the CGNG. This report that we put out 2 months ago, I think is the most comprehensive publicly available document on the new generation cartel in English. which is not a very significant accomplishment, by the way, because there's so little written about this. As one of my law enforcement colleagues pointed out, yeah, that's not hard to do, because there's so little written about this organization. It's so new. But what we've tried to do is compile as much information in an open source document as possible, and I would highly encourage those of you who are trying to understand this organization to take a look at it. We've also got a couple of papers looking at organized crime and violence in Baja California Sur. This is another theater in which the conflicts between the new generation cartel, remnants of Sinaloa, also their allies, the CUNYs, all this is playing out in tragic ways in Baja Sur. And that report is well worth a look. And finally, since it's an election year, we wanted to do something special, and we looked at the assassination of mayors. We limited our look at local officials. Certainly you could broaden this and look at regidores and síndicos and other local officials in Mexico. But we wanted to find out what is happening with mayoral violence in Mexico. And I will talk about this very briefly in the presentation in more detail. But if you want the full story, you can go to our website, justiceinmexico.org, and track any of this stuff down. Okay, that's enough advertising and shameless plugging. Let's get to the main event. As June pointed out, as all of you are well aware, last year was a record year in homicides in Mexico, and ironically, in this slide, last year is not on the docket here. You can see 2017 is not represented in this slide, and it's not represented in this slide because I want to make a point about the complexity of our challenge as analysts in trying to understand homicide trends in Mexico. The data that are represented here in this bar graph are data from INEGI, the National Statistics Agency of Mexico. And INEGI is sort of the gold standard, that's why I use gold, the gold standard on information in Mexico. But INEGI doesn't publish its official statistics on homicide, which are based on medical examiner reports, combined with law enforcement reports. So they get even cases that maybe law enforcement doesn't detect, that appear to be a homicide, they calculate those. And so they put those numbers out after a long internal review process, usually in the summer of the year after the year in question. So we should expect to see INEGI's data for 2017 sometime around August 2018. But what you can see from this image here is, there was a slight bulge in homicides that almost no one talks about in the 1990s, right? But at that time, in the mid-1990s, around the time of the peso crisis, there was real concern about Mexico's public security situation. But over time, moving into the 2000s, we see that actually there was this period of wonderful decline in homicide rates, right? Actually, the lowest year in homicides in Mexico was the year following Felipe Calderon's, the President Felipe Calderon's inauguration as president of Mexico. Everybody says the violence started with Felipe Calderon. And that's true, but you have to lag that by 1 year, because really, Calderon takes office, nothing happens. Actually, the country gets a lot more peaceful until January 2008. And there's a story behind that. It has to do with the Beltran-Leyva organization, the falling out of the Sinaloa cartel, and so on. We don't see an explosion of violence until 2008. And so what happens from 2007 to 2010-11, is basically a tripling of the homicide rate in Mexico. If we had continued the trajectory here of homicides, Mexico might look like the United States in 2017 or 2018, with maybe 5, 6, 7 homicides per 100,000. Look at that slope. That was a really good trajectory for Mexico in the early 2000s. But something happened, right? Now, if you want to know what happened in 2017, the data source you have to use is the Mexican government's National Public Security System, Sistema Nacional de Seguridad Pública, the SNSP. SNSP's data are law enforcement data on homicides. So these are actual law enforcement investigations into homicides, and they are case-level data. So one case could be 4 homicides. And so SNSP data are useful in that they tell us what law enforcement's looking at, and they track the general patterns and trends. But you'll notice that there's a gap between SNSP and what the INEGI is tracking, because one is tracking bodies, the other is tracking cases, right? So we have to look at both of these types of data, both of these data sources in order to understand what's going on, particularly if you want to know what's happening currently, because what's great about SNSP is that they report their data monthly. FBI, where's FBI? Is FBI? You don't have to reveal yourself. But FBI, you guys, your Uniform Crime Index, I gotta wait like 13, 16 months to figure out what happened and what the homicide is. It's amazing that SNSP is giving us monthly data. Of course, there's gonna be errors, there's gonna, it's not complete information, but imagine monthly homicide data at the municipal level. That's an incredible feat. And our Mexican colleagues, as much as we have concerns, as much as they have limitations, this is a remarkable accomplishment for law enforcement to get the data out that quickly. Problem is, it's not case level data. It's case level data. It's not individual level data. So one of the things that we did one of the things that SNSP started doing as of 4 years ago in 2014. Is that 4 years? Yeah, 4 years ago. In 2014, is they started now tracking individual cases. They developed a whole new methodology, and so they do actually have data on the number of individual cases of homicide. And so you've got now 3 sources of data to measure your homicides. You got the INEGI data, you got the case level data from SNSP, and then you've got the individual level data. The individual level data is great, but it only goes back 4 years. So if you want to understand long-term trends, it's not that helpful. If you want to understand what's going on in terms of absolute body count, it's great. So one of the things that we have done to try to deal with the gap in data, particularly from INEGI for individual case level data, because what we're missing are the medical examiner reports, is we've tried to estimate based on the margin of difference between SNSP and INEGI. We've tried to estimate that the total number of individual homicides we're likely to see when INEGI comes out with its announcement in August. And by our estimates, it's clearly going to be over 30,000. So you're hearing 29,000 now, worst year ever. Yes, okay. But get ready, because you're probably going to see over, when in August, when they get final figures, total number, you're talking 30,000 people. That's a very long-winded way for me to get from 29,000 to 30,000. But the point is, this is a really, really bad year. And yet we still don't know until the INEGI figures come out, because the INEGI figures are the basis of the population calculation for rate. We don't know how 2017 compares to 2011 when it comes down to controlling for population. The per 100,000 rate is not yet known. So it's possible that it may be higher than we think it is. If you look at the data monthly, that's what this it's like December, April, August, and December. If you look at data on a monthly basis, you can see some finer variations in the trends here. And what you can see is that over the course of the Calderon administration, there were 122,000 people killed. Over the course of the Peña Nieto administration, we're looking at another 116 so far in the first 5 years. So we're talking 250,000 people that have been killed, been victims of homicide since 2007. It's over 300,000 for the century, since 2001. But the heavy concentration of violence is really in this period between 2008 and 2012, and then again from 2015 to 2017. So there are these sort of 2 waves of violence, right, that we can talk about with different trends. Going back to this question of the rate, if INEGI's data match our projections, then we're looking at definitely a slightly higher homicide rate. This is a rate of around 25.1 per 100,000, compared to the rate back in 2011, which was around 24 point something, 24.8 3, I think it was, in 2011. And this is just pure, like, the nerds out there, hopefully, are you with me? Is there any nerds out there who are interested in, like, controlling for population and trying to make sure that we're absolutely sure that it was the worst year on record? If you're not a nerd, I apologize. But for me, you know, the big question is, I don't know if it was the worst year on record, because I want to actually, Mexico grew by a couple million people in the span of you know, just 8 years. And so we have to be real careful about how we use the language. So when I say it was a record year for homicides in Mexico, I'm always careful to say there were a record number of homicides. But I'm not sure, 100% sure, that we have a record homicide rate. Or in other words, that the violence is so much worse than 2011. Just, you know, fun academic nerd type stuff. One of the other things that we know in terms of trends is that there is an enormous geographic concentration of violence. This is just 2017. In our report, we detail, you know, over the years how violence has shifted to different areas. But as you can see, you know, violence is clustered in certain places. It's clustered here and here and here. Somewhat down here, somewhat in here. We saw surprising rise in violence over here in Quintana Roo. There's some violence down here in the Gulf, also up along the border by Matamoros. There's clearly patterns here, and understanding what drives those patterns is really important if we want to understand the problem of homicide in Mexico. And June's already talked a fair amount about this, but I'm going to hold off in going into more detail for the moment. Because I want to also point out some of the numbers when it comes down to the municipal level. For several years running, as most of you know, Juarez was Mexico's most violent city. Charles Bowden famously described it as Murder City, right? And it has been, it was at that time being described as the murder capital of the world. You had in excess of 20 to 100 homicides. I think it got as high as, you guys can tell me if I'm wrong, 26 or 2,800 homicides in a given year. That's an enormous amount of violence. The homicide rate in the city was triple digits per 100,000. It was 120 or something like that per 100,000 at one point. Today in Mexico, or in 2017 in Mexico, there's no city that reaches the level or the toll of violence in terms of total body count. We do see that Acapulco remains highly violent, and if you look at the rate for Acapulco, it's a similar rate of violence per capita that we were seeing in Juarez. But what stood out to me in 2017 was the fact that Acapulco was actually displaced by Tijuana. Tijuana was, you know, the bridesmaid for many years. I don't know how that happened. Magic. Tijuana was sort of the bridesmaid for a number, like the last 10 years. It got beaten first by Juarez, then it was getting beaten by Acapulco, and last year they finally made it into first place as the most violent city in Mexico. And what's noticeable, like it's almost a doubling. It's like, you know, an 80% increase or so in the number of homicides. So this is a dramatic, very rapid shift in the increase in violence. Right? There is a gradual increase that I'll show you in the next slide that begins back in 2014-15, but the jump in 2017 was just astonishing. You can see there's some other bad places. What's noticeable, look at this statistic here at the bottom. The top 10 municipalities in the country account for about in 2016 accounted for about 1 in 5 homicides in Mexico. Last year, that number went up. For the first time in a while, it went up to about 1 in 4 homicides taking place in 10 cities. Right? Now, June mentioned that Latin America is one of the most violent countries in the world, or sorry, Latin America is one of the most violent regions in the world. Mexico is one of the most violent countries in that region, and these cities are the most violent cities in that country. And so a very significant share of the world's death by homicide is taking place in just a handful of cities. Now, 26% of homicides is in the top 10 is bad. But if you remember back in 2010, 33%, it was 32 or 33% of all homicides in Mexico took place in 5 cities. Thanks to Juarez, in part. Juarez, Tijuana, Monterrey, Chihuahua, and one other city, it might have been Culiacan at that point in time, made up basically about a third of the homicides in Mexico. And I told Mexican authorities at that time, hey, you want to lower your homicide rate, just let us move the border, 10, 15 miles south, and you can just erase those numbers from your statistics. Then it'd be our problem. It wasn't convincing, but these statistics are really staggering. It really tells us that with a focused approach in certain geographic areas, we could make a big difference. If we could figure out what's going wrong in these places, and if we could come up with a good strategy for deterrence of violence in these areas, we can actually bring the homicide rate down. Maybe not quite as quickly as it's gone up, but certainly within our lifetime, right? This is a fixable problem in our lifetime. And I'll zoom in just on Tijuana because it is this special case from last year. Prior to 2015, what everyone pointed to in Tijuana was these 2 spikes in violence. And everyone thinks of Tijuana as this hyper-violence context. But really, violence in Tijuana only got what we might call out of control in 2 very specific periods in 2008 and 2009. There were these 2 big periods of conflict between criminal organizations that led to a dramatic spike in violence. But otherwise, homicide levels weren't ideal, but they weren't what we would, let's call this the out of control line. This is the monthly rate of number of homicides. You didn't get up to 100 homicides per month in Tijuana, but for like a 4-month period over a 2-year period, or 4 months out of the 2-year period. What's really scary about 2017 is it's out of control, every month and way out of control for most of 2007, late 2016 and 2017. Something has shifted in Tijuana. Part of its population, again, you got to control for population growth when looking at these things. But even as we saw in the previous slide, controlling for population, we're seeing a dramatic increase in homicides. Now, this graph would be a lot more dramatic in looking at homicides if I took out this other line here. But I think this other line is really interesting. This is the line for lesiones, or injuries. So notice that as homicides go up, the number of injuries has been going down. And the ratio of homicides to injuries, basically, has shrunk over time. I have some ideas. I don't have a well-supported hypothesis, but it seems like people are becoming better shots, right? Or the methodologies that they're using for acts of violence are becoming more lethal. More firepower, maybe more rounds, right? And so that's something I think we need to look carefully at. I know ATF is here. I think it'd be really interesting to be looking at what's happening in terms of questions of lethality when we talk about injuries to death. Because there is something happening there, and it's a great topic for me to have some graduate student look at, but it's a really very specific area that needs more attention.
Injuries by gunfire?
These are all lesiones dolorosas. So it would include armas blandas, like knives, right? And so it may be that people just like to do knife fighting more here, right? This was more of a dual atmosphere, right? I don't know, but what I love about doing sort of data-driven analysis and research is that you figure out what the trend is, and then you get all kinds of fascinating questions, right? Just like that one. And that's our job as analysts and our job as social scientists and researchers to try to figure out how to answer those questions about what's going on with the data. And right now, all I got is the questions and some ideas. But we really need to look more closely at these trends to understand and what's actually going on behind these to understand. But clearly something is shifting, and it's arguably a worrying trend. It wasn't worrying when lesiones were going down and violence was low, but it's worrying that lesiones are low and violence and homicides are going up, right? Because it means that people are being killed on more easily. Oops, sorry. What I want to talk about, though, speaking of trying to understand these trends, I want to talk about the role of organized crime. You talk to people about problems of crime and violence, and often one of the things that I hear as a researcher is, well, it's the poverty, right? It's the inequality in Mexico. And, Mexico's, even though they've raised their minimum wage to what, $8 a day. Even though it used to be $5 a day, now it's gone up like 40-50% to, I think it's 800 pesos a day. Or they're negotiating it at 800 pesos a day. Despite that very generous increase, there are real serious socioeconomic problems that are pervasive in Mexico, and it is absolutely true that the people that are most likely to get caught up in the kind of violence that I just described are poor people who had limited educational and limited economic opportunities. There's no doubt about that. Yet, it's hard to explain the patterns that we've just seen. The homicide rate tripling in just 3 years. That doesn't correlate to the poverty rate. The poverty rate didn't triple in 3 years, right? You look at Tijuana and you see these massive spikes in violence. And not like suddenly there was an injection of poverty in 2008 for 2 months, and then all the poor people went away, right? That doesn't square. The other trend that doesn't wash is, the poorest areas in Mexico are located where? What was geographically, is it the north or is it the south? Right, but where's the violence? It's in the north, it's in the Pacific coast. So it doesn't square either that poverty and socioeconomic despair are the roots of violence if the poorest areas of Mexico are not the most violent areas of Mexico. So I don't want to dismiss entirely the notion that poverty and socioeconomic factors are important. I actually think they're very important for understanding who gets involved in violence. But I think if we want to understand what's driving these sudden changes in violence, we have to look at the role of organized crime. This is why we've spent the better part of the last decade trying to parse out which of these killings can we reasonably attribute to organized crime groups. And there are a number of organizations that do this. I'm throwing a whole bunch of data at you right now. This is, at one point the Mexican government was tracking these trends. The SNSP, the National Public Security System, had its own database of organized crime style killings. But it was contentious, it was controversial, because people said, well, how can you say someone was involved in organized crime if you haven't conducted a proper investigation? And only 10% of homicides get fully investigated in Mexico, on average, to the conclusion of that case. There's a 10% clearance rate for homicides, right? So how do you know it was an organized crime killing and not, a jealous husband or whatever? You don't. But again, AK-47, I am a drug trafficker written on the body. Like, those things are the telltale signs. So groups or newspaper organizations like Reforma, a national newspaper in Mexico, Millennial, another national magazine and newspaper in Mexico, and private organizations like Landia, which is a consulting firm run by Eduardo Guerrero, who was mentioned in June's talk, and our organization as well. A number of organizations have been trying to figure out ways of classifying and tracking homicides that are related to, or appear to be related to, organized crime. I like to call them OCG-style homicides, right? Not gangland or Gangnam style, but gangland-style homicides, because they have these unique characteristics. And I've been criticized, this effort to do this is often criticized. There's a woman at New Mexico State University named Molly Malloy. She says, no, you shouldn't do this because, number one, every life is valuable, and number two, the methodologies used to try to classify these kinds of homicides are problematic, right? Because you're kind of giving it a smell test and saying, well, yeah, this looks like it could be organized crime. That's why it's important to say they're organized crime style. They're not necessarily done by organized crime, so if it is a jealous husband who wants to make it look like organized crime, what is important to me is that the impact, the social impact of hanging a body from a bridge, or decapitating someone and putting their head in public, or shooting 15 people at a birthday party, that's different in my read. That's different than a lover's quarrel. Right? It has different consequences. And arguably, if lovers' quarrels accounted for a third of homicides in Mexico, we want to try to track that, right? But then, how do you define lovers' quarrel? I mean, do ex-boyfriends count? Or does it have to be someone you're actually with now? Are we only going to count marriages? What if you haven't been dating each other for 10 years? Is that still a lover's quarrel? There's always going to be problems of definition and conceptualization, and these are data problems, always. But I think it's worthwhile. Another example would be intrafamilial violence. How do you define intrafamilial violence? If that's representing a half or a third of your homicides, how would you measure it? Do ex-husbands count as part of your family or not? Does your long-lost cousin that you accidentally killed and you didn't know he was your cousin until you checked it out on 23andMe? You're always going to have these definitional problems. So my view is we need to track this problem because it is a major part of the violence. And particularly, you can see that. You compare the number of homicides total by whatever measure you want to use. Those three measures I showed you earlier. The medical examiner reports from UNEHI, the law enforcement cases tracked by SNSP. Now I'm throwing all kinds of data at you, so it's a little confusing. But depending on what measure you're comparing to what other measure, these homicides, these gangland-style homicides represent between a third and half of the violence that we've seen over the last decade. That is not a small quotient. That is not a small problem. And so it merits consideration. If you took away those organized crime-style homicides, just the ones that we've been able to track and count, you would see significant reductions in Mexico's overall homicide rate. The rate for 2017 I mentioned is over 25 per 100,000. If there were no organized crime-style killings as we've tracked them, the rate would be about 13 or 14 per 100,000. Right? So this matters a lot. This is a big chunk of the violence. And I underscore this because there are some of my colleagues who I greatly respect have conducted research. There's a great paper by Rob Mugga and Carlos Villalta, and they point out the socioeconomic issues, and they say we really should be focusing on poverty alleviation and job creation. I don't discount that. I think we absolutely should. But if you only focus on that and you're not focused on what organized crime is doing, you're missing a big part of the equation. Sorry, this is going back, this is going forward. Now, if you're going to focus on organized crime, you really have to focus on the dynamics between organized crime groups and the specific, I would say, triggers that lead to the increases in violence. And so the slide I showed you earlier with this increase during the Calderon administration, decrease towards the late Calderon administration, early Peña, and then the increases we've seen in the late Peña administration, they make a lot more sense if you plug in some information about what was going on between organized crime groups in this period. For example, right here, the arrest of Alfredo Beltran Leyva is what kicks off the violence here, right? It's not a tripling of homicide, of poverty rates. It's not the economic crisis of 2009. It's the fact that one guy was arrested This guy, Alfredo Beltran-Leyva, some of you may know, his nickname was El Mochomo. He was the brother of El Barbas, Alberto Beltran-Leyva. And his arrest should have never happened. He shouldn't have been arrested because it was the job of the Sinaloa organization, it was the job of Chapo Guzman to tip off Alfredo and let him know that there was going to be an arrest so that he could escape, like they often do, right? But for whatever reason, Chapo decided to betray the Beltran-Leyva organization and to betray their allies in the Juarez cartel. And that arrest was a sign that Chapo was defecting from a long-standing collaboration between three major organized crime families or groups. And it triggered an all-out battle royale between Sinaloa, Juarez, and the Beltran-Leyva organization. At the same time, you saw other violence ensuing, in part because of the breakout of the Zetas, the La Familia organization. Right? There are other stories or subplots in this story. But it's very important to underscore how a particular event can trigger increases in violence. And each of these little spikes are probably connected to some other trigger or event, right? Maybe a shipment that went wrong and somebody had to pay. Or maybe, in some cases it is girlfriends. In some cases, I want to come back to the love triangles and the lovers' quarrels. Sometimes there was a great case in Baja, California where I think it was El Teo got romantically involved with someone, and there was some clashes over this particular narco-novia. But the bottom line is, if we want to understand what leads to this sort of these explosions of violence, we have to think of organized crime groups as operating in either equilibrium or disequilibrium. They're either getting along and things are running smooth and everything's in balance, or something gets messed up and there is suddenly maybe a need to punish somebody, or a need or an opportunity to move in on somebody else's turf. Whatever it is, whatever was working before is no longer working, and that is what leads to the clashes that we see. And that's why, in particular, one of the things that we highlight, or would like to, that we point out in our report, is the role that taking out certain individuals can play. June mentioned that the increase in violence has been associated with the arrest and ultimate extradition of Chapo Guzman, third arrest of Chapo Guzman, and his extradition to the United States. But what's interesting is Chapo was arrested sometime back here, right? The second time. And then there's this period of actually really stable, low levels of violence in Mexico. And if we didn't know what happened later, we might say, well, that just doesn't make any sense. You arrested Chapo and things calmed down. But we actually know that Chapo was pretty much running the shots behind the scenes. It was sort of like, the Pablo Escobar prison escapade, right? He had effective command and control. And so Sinaloa was able to continue to keep the peace, and many of its key rivals had been taken out at this point. And so maybe the safest place for Chapo was being in prison, or the appearance of being in prison, whatever you want to call it. But this period, I like to think of as that period that June referred to, this Pax Sinaloa, in which Sinaloa was able to consolidate power. Most of its rivals were removed or eliminated. And then it's not until he is captured the third and last time, and it is not until really after he is moved to right here to Juarez that we start to see a lot of defections and a lot of clashes between members of his organization, right? Because now it's clear that the leader is being removed. There are opportunities maybe to try to rise to the top of the organization if you're the brother of Chapo Guzman or one of the Damasos, right? You may want to try to move to the top of the organization. So you've got internal fighting. But then you also have possible interlopers, rival organizations, whether it's the Zetas, not really a threat anymore, or breakout groups like the New Generation Cartel, who say, now we're going to come in and try to take over areas that were previously occupied by El Chapo. This is what happens, and June alluded to this, this is one of the unintended consequences of leadership removal, right? Or leadership disruption. It leads to a disequilibrium or a lack of equilibrium between existing arrangements among cartels and organized crime groups, and new opportunities for competition. Some people don't like to use the word cartel. I love to use the word cartel because a cartel, in a business sense, is a group of firms that are collaborating to minimize competition, right? Some people will say, no, well, it's about price fixing. No, not all cartels focus on price fixing. Some cartels focus just on geographic distribution. Like when I was a kid, there was the ice cream cartel. You could get Breyers. You could get Breyers on the East Coast. You can only get Dryers on the West Coast. I don't know what you guys did here in El Paso, but we didn't have Dryers and they didn't have Breyers. That was the ice cream cartel, right? So dividing territory is one way to minimize competition. And that's one of the ways that real cartels in real life, real drug cartels, use competition reduction, right? But what happens, unfortunately, is that sometimes somebody breaks the deal, right? Somebody encroaches or tries to steal a little bit more. They want a couple extra crumbs, and next thing you know, boom, you're at loggerheads. You're having conflict and competition, and that's what explains a lot of this violence. Please.
Would you put the release of Rafael Carlos in 2014 on that chart?
That's another good one. Yeah, absolutely. And it's one I haven't looked at closely enough. June's actually thought a lot more about this than I have. I'm going to start deflecting questions back to June, now that just like she did to me. But honestly, I think this goes to her point about we don't know enough about what's really going on inside Sinaloa, and particularly what Caro Quintero's role is. Is he his new own organization, or is he now a new pillar within the Sinaloa group? We'll find out when you guys find out and the information comes out into the public source. But for now, I think certainly it's probably one of the factors contributing to it's a change in the dynamics, and any change in the dynamics is potentially something that could contribute to this. Now you might say, wait a minute, sure, you arrested Benjamin Ariano Felix here and extradited him. Sorry, you arrested him. We arrested him back here, and we extradited him here. It took like 9 years, right? But we also got rid of Trevino here. So we took out kingpins, and violence went down. So the kingpin strategy is not universally going to lead to violence, right? But understand that part of the reason that these arrests did not lead to increases in violence is that there was a larger organization that was able to establish what June used a really interesting word, hegemony. Right? Taking out these other violent actors cleared the road for Sinaloa to basically move in and take over and have violence go down. These were the groups that were fighting against Sinaloa. Not to mention also the La Familia organization gets taken out here. The Knights Templar organization gets taken out. So removing competition helps cartels achieve their goal. Peace. The ultimate goal of every cartel is peace. Right? They don't want to fight anybody. They want to do business. They want to make money. They want as few problems as possible. They don't like to fight. But they do when they have to in order to maintain their revenue stream. Right? Look at peace as the natural state of cartels, and violence as an aberration that's caused by disruptions that lead to competition. One thought. What's that?
One opinion Nietos coming in, Gentes, was to create a more stable society and
that's right.
less violent.
It's also, I don't know if you guys... There could have been some pacting going on here, absolutely. I mean, at the local level in Tijuana, back in, I don't know if it was 2008 or 9, a gentleman by the name of Jorge Hengron ran for mayor of Tijuana, and he ran on a platform, he ran for the platform, we're going to control crime. And I think that's a great slogan. That's a great slogan, right? But it has a double meaning. And unfortunately, as was mentioned in the earlier discussion, Due to the high level of infiltration and corruption in Mexico, what avoided this problem of violence in the past, particularly in the 1970s, 80s, somewhat in the 1990s, what helped to minimize competition was state-regulated intervention in an illicit economy. Because you had governors, you had presidents, well, maybe not presidents, but high-level officials, let's just say, high-level government officials who were aware of and coordinating with, and in some cases, some research suggests, dictating the terms of agreements that would divide up the territory, that would limit the control of the plaza to certain groups. And by the way, this is where the word cartel comes from. It's an agreement. Carta, right? It's a signed agreement about how things will be done. And so part of what's changed in Mexico, or what has complicated the dynamics and has led to deregulation by the government and more competition among illicit firms, is the fact that there is, unfortunately, there are multiple hands on the wheel of the state, right? So we have 5 different parties in power now. There are more opportunities to access protection at different levels, and so that has also contributed to the complication of controlling markets and dividing up markets. Last year, the key conflict zones were these. You had Sinaloa fighting against the New Generation Cartel in northwestern Mexico in this corner. You had Sinaloa fighting against the New Generation and their allies, the Coonies. Oh, I'm sorry, notably, the New Generation has been really good at making alliances with the old enemies of the Sinaloa Cartel, like the AFO, who basically had to cry uncle when Sinaloa moved in and took over the route in Tijuana. They had long controlled Mexicali, but when the leaders of the AFO were taken out from 2003 to 2008 and 9, it basically allowed Sinaloa to move in and be the dominant organization in the plaza. You guys would know better than I do the specific fragments that they've been collaborating with here in the Juarez region. They have not, to my knowledge, been doing much work. I've read that they have been working with some fragments of the Zeta organizations, and I couldn't name those fragments. We have it documented in the report. But the point is, one of the things that's really interesting to me about CJNG is the fact that they are coalition builders. To go back to an earlier phrase, peacemakers. Right? Right now, I know it doesn't seem like it, right? When they're shooting down helicopters and taking on the Mexican military, but they are showing an entrepreneurial capability for forging alliances and establishing a broad coalition that looks a lot like what a cartel does and what a cartel seeks to achieve, which is agreements and peace, right? But of course, in order to do that, they have to wipe out the previous hegemon. They have to wipe out or get the previous hegemon to beg for mercy, like Sinaloa did to AFO and other organizations in the past. But I don't think this picture can be explained by poverty. I don't think this picture can be explained by the unemployment rate. I think the only way to explain this picture is to understand that you have illicit firms that are vying for control of strategically important drug-producing and drug transit areas. And the dynamics between those organizations are what determines whether X number of people live or die. So organized crime matters is sort of the point of the talk. And the organized crime group that matters most is the New Generation Cartel. I'm not going to go into great detail, but I have this handy chart here that sort of shows the evolution of the New Generation Cartel. The New Generation Cartel has its roots in the Valencia family, which was a pretty humble family of farmers in Michoacan back in the 70s, when there was some serious problems. There was drought. Gradually there was this in the 80s, especially deregulation of agriculture in Mexico, and this family needed to stay in business and find ways to make money, just like lots of farmers in Michoacan back in that time period, which is one reason, going back to this question about Sinaloa, saying that the Sinaloans were the main sources of this. It has a lot to do with the emergence of the drug sector in Mexico, has a lot to do with the problems of farmers in the 70s and 80s in different places. And you've got great farmland in Sinaloa, you've got great farmland in Michoacan, and these were areas that in the 1970s and 80s were affected by basically the failure, by modernization of agriculture and by lots of other things. But in order to keep his family fed, this guy named Jose Valencia started adding some new crops to his rotation, right? Opium poppy and marijuana. And we don't know exactly how or when there was a transition here. Jose Valencia is the last person to leave who entered the family in, and who apparently is the only one to leave the head of the family's illicit operations without being arrested or killed. Everybody else in this lineage, until now, has been either arrested or otherwise taken out. I think most of them are all arrests, right? Armando Valencia, Luis Valencia, Ventura Valencia. They ran the organization from the late 70s to 2003, when we saw a series of arrests. Then when those guys were arrested, when Armando was arrested, Luis takes over with a next generation Valencia named Oscar Nava, El Lobo. His brother, I forget what his nickname was, it's like Fox maybe, I can't remember. Juan takes over after El Lobo's arrested. Meanwhile, and that's a very short-lived period, you see groups internally within what at that point was known as the Millennial Cartel. Sorry, I gotta step back. I apologize. I'm so excited about the so-and-so begat so-and-so begat so-and-so. It's like reading Genesis all over again. Sorry, let me back up. Because something happens here right around this time. The Valencia family gets kicked out of Michoacan. Basically, right? Because there are some new groups that are emerging in Michoacan, which eventually become known as, sing it with me, the La Familia organization, the La Familia Michoacana, right? So La Familia emerges in the late 90s, and these guys basically get forced out. They have to move over to Jalisco to set up their operations, Jalisco and Colima, and they basically set up what becomes known as the Millennial Cartel. And the Millennial Cartel basically becomes sort of a subsidiary of the Sinaloa organization. And Sinaloa hooks them up with a dude named Yi Gong. Does everyone remember Yi Gong? This guy was arrested, I want to say 2004, 2005, I can't remember. But when he was arrested, they went into his house, and his house was lined with millions, tens of millions of dollars in the wallpaper, like behind the wallpaper. And Yi Gong had served two key functions for the Sinaloa cartel. One was he was their connection back to Southeast Asia for precursor chemicals. And so it's Yi Gong that connects the members of the Millennial organization to their precursor chemical supplies to help them become the meth kings of Mexico. But also he was involved in money laundering operations. He would fly up to Vegas and lose millions of dollars at the gambling tables as a way of funneling money into the casinos, so that they could then transfer those monies into legitimate operations and so on. And there were a couple of US banks that were ultimately investigated and fined for their collaboration with Yi Gong's operation. Yi Gong was arrested by Mexican authorities and then shipped to the extradited to the United States. I think his case is still ongoing, so he is an alleged drug trafficker. But the point is, it was thanks to him that we saw this shift and this new opportunity for for what becomes a new generation cartel. Now, they didn't break out as the new generation cartel until after the arrest of the Nava Valencias, Oscar and Juan. And it's because at that point in time, they had been reporting to a very kind older gentleman by the name of Ignacio Coronel, El Nacho Coronel. And when Ignacio was taken out, Sinaloa actually suffered a series of very harsh blows. I think it was 2000. When was he? Does anyone remember when Nacho was killed? I think he was killed in. I think it was later. It was like 11 or 12. It was during the height of the conflict between Juarez, Beltran, and Sinaloa. It wasn't clear, I think, to corrupt Mexican authorities which group was going to win, so they were going after the different groups, I think, almost equally. But after a point, particularly after Nacho was taken out, there was no clear sense of where the leadership was going to be, and New Generation broke out on its own. And they broke out in spectacular fashion. You may remember the Mata Zetas. There was a group, and I believe it was 2013, 2014, that went into a suburb of Veracruz, stopped late afternoon rush hour traffic, and dumped, I think it was 30 bodies onto the roadway. And they left a sign saying, "We are the Mata Zetas. This is punishment for so-and-so." And the message was that there was a new vigilante group that was going to be out fighting against the Zetas. Later, we pieced together, of course, that these Mata Zetas were actually elements of the New Generation Cartel. But I love the tactic, right? They come up with this cool name, that they're the Mata Zetas. They say that they're helping to get rid of drug traffickers. And, it's subterfuge. It's confusing. They're really clever about this. You watch their videos, the New Generation Cartel videos, and they talk about how they're there to protect the public. That they're only drug traffickers. We only traffic drugs. We don't kidnap. We don't extort. We're the good drug traffickers. So they have this whole PR strategy that's really fascinating. They also, the New Generation was later learned to be behind the autodefensas. Right? In Michoacan, 2014, 13 and 14, you start seeing these self-defense groups that are emerging in Michoacan. And they're saying, we're here to protect the people, we're fed up with organized crime, we're going to take out the La Familia organization and the remnants of the Zetas. Well, guess who's behind some of those groups? The New Generation Cartel, because they want to get rid of the competition. So, New Generation, you have to admire. Well, I don't admire. You have to respect the brilliance behind some of the strategies that they're using, and whether it's their cleverness in using alliances, their very sophisticated approaches to manipulating public opinion and what we think is actually happening. I mean, they are really thinking about this in very clever ways. And of course, it's after the arrest of Eric Valencia Salazar that we see the emergence of the man who used to be an enforcer for Nacho Coronel, who was allegedly, we can't verify, I haven't been able to verify this, maybe you guys can, was allegedly a police officer at the municipal level in Mexico after he was released from the United States from drug charges in Northern California back in the 1990s. But this is the new head of the New Generation Cartel. We deported him, went back to Mexico, became what is now probably Mexico's most successful drug trafficker after he was a police officer, right? So there's an opportunity there for coordination and cooperation between U.S. and Mexican law enforcement to tag guys who have been arrested for drug offenses so they don't become police officers and wind up major cartel operatives. But I'll get to that in the recommendations. Vic has told me I spend too much time on the New Generation Cartel. I really don't want to do that, but it's so fascinating, right? It's a really interesting new development. But I'm going to have to skimp a little bit on some other things. One thing I like to point out is that you've had problems with femicides here in Juarez. It is a serious problem. I don't want to undermine that, but if you want to solve the homicide problem, you've got to deal with a substance that is far more dangerous than methamphetamine, far more dangerous than heroin, far more dangerous than cocaine. There's one substance that drives violence to extraordinary levels all around the world, whether it's in conflict or in crime, and that substance is testosterone. 90% of the world's criminals and violent offenders are men. What's wrong with us, guys? Right? What is it that leads to this problem? If someone can solve this problem, ideally not with like testosterone reduction, you're going to be a very wealthy person, very wealthy woman if you can solve this problem. I'll also point out the problem of journalists. Alfredo Corchado is here, thankfully, after being threatened by Mexican organized crime groups, particularly by the Zetas. And you can read about that in another shameless plug for Midnight in Mexico, his book. He has a new book coming out, by the way. But the homicide rate for journalists is about 3 times the homicide rate for ordinary people in Mexico. 3 times. There's about 30, I think it was 34,000 journalists in 2016. If you take that number of journalists and divide it per 1,000, and then compare it to the per 1,000 rate for ordinary people, ordinary people die are murdered at a rate of 0.21 per 1,000 in Mexico. That's basically 21 per 100,000 reduced by a couple of decimal points, right? So for journalists, the rate is around 7 per 100,000, a little over 7 per 100,000. Sorry, 0.7 per 1,000, 0.7 per 1,000. Stick with me on these numbers that I'm not showing you on a board. 0.21 for the average person per 1,000. 0.7 for journalists. That's basically triple the rate. 0.76 per 1,000. So there's a real serious problem with violence against journalists. We learned this year, by taking the numbers for mayors killed, that the rate for mayors is 2.1 per 1,000. That's 3 times the rate for journalists. Basically 12 times the rate, 10 times the rate for ordinary people.
City mayor?
That's only the sitting mayors. I'm not counting the former mayors and the mayoral candidates. So sitting mayors, and there were 2.1, the rate in 2016 for sitting mayors, there were, I think, 4 mayors killed that year, is that right? Was 2.1 per 1,000. And depending on the year, it varies. It goes up as high as, I think we counted 7 or 8 per 1,000. So, I mean, the toll of political violence in Mexico is something people haven't been talking a lot about. I think we're going to be talking a lot more about it in the coming months. Good question about the acronyms. These acronyms are for candidate, mayor, and ex-mayor. Sorry, thank you for the question. It should be in your bulletin. Last, I'm going to point out number of extortion cases. This is a slightly updated figure from the one I gave you. It includes data through 2017. What's interesting to me is homicides are at record levels. Extortions are not for 2016 and 17. Same with kidnappings. Homicides are at record levels, kidnappings are not. So while it was the most violent year when we come to homicides, it's not the most violent year with regard to some of the other kinds of crimes that we're talking about. Now there's some explanations for that. It's a trend. I'm not going to talk about it in Q&A. But one possibility is when you're busy killing people, you don't have time to extort them and kidnap them. That's a hypothesis that we can test. I've got 5 policy recommendations in 1 minute to go over them. So, one thing I push for, I mean, this kind of analysis takes real effort. And our organization has been fortunate that we've been able to keep this kind of effort going for about 10 years. We would certainly welcome any funding that anyone would like to provide to enable us to continue this kind of work. But also I think that our law enforcement agencies and other non-governmental organizations need to be looking at this problem. It's a serious problem. We need to make more of an effort to understand the problem of organized crime style violence. And analyze it. There's a lot of good new research that's coming out in this area, and I think we need to continue to foster as much research and analysis on this topic as we can. We also need, obviously, to do more about policing and prosecutions in Mexico. In particular, you can't just take out the top guy. You've got to maybe start working in Mexico on a RICO-style, comprehensive, organization-wide investigation that doesn't even stop at the organization. It goes into the halls of government. It goes into the private sector, and it pulls those sources of support. How much political will is there for that in Mexico? Ask me on July 2nd. Special measures to address political violence, I think are going to be needed as we go into the lead up to this election. There's been some talk about providing oficialia mayor escorts and protection for candidates. That's great for the national level candidates, but as we saw, mayors are some of the worst at risk. And that's something that really needs special attention. Anti-corruption. It was mentioned in the earlier talk. I won't go into great detail. I have some ideas that we can talk about in Q&A. But I also think this question of the public health approach, we need to have a really serious, systematic, and careful discussion about what's happening on public health. As I've said in other forums, and I was recently talking about with Angela Corchera just yesterday and today, legalizing marijuana has robbed Mexican drug trafficking organizations of about 20 to 25% of their revenues. Do you think that makes them happy? Do you think that reduces competition? Does that lead to peace? No. It actually intensifies competition, which intensifies violence. And so one of the short-term, at least, consequences of changing our drug policies is going to be drug traffickers diversifying the kind of work that they do, going into kidnapping, going into extortion, challenging each other for control of different territories in ways that they hadn't before, and ultimately, in the short term at least, more violence among those criminal organizations. So we need to, if we're going to experiment with drugs, we got to be really smart about it. So I do think that it will, in the long run, it takes away the money that enables them to corrupt and makes them more easily targetable by law enforcement. But there's so many issues that need to be discussed here. I need to stop talking and start listening to your ideas and questions. So I'll do that. Thank you so much, Vic.
We do have some time for some questions.
I'll leave the other 100 slides or so for another talk. So, any questions? Fantastic. Oh, Jim, please.
You showed on the sort of the trigger points, the jailing of, let's go back to that, El Chapo in Juarez.
Mm-hmm.
Why did that happen? Why did the violence go up with that?
My simplistic answer would be once he was relocated, I think it was a clear sign that he was being, that he was on his way out. At least that's how I would read that sign. It could, yeah, that's where I would leave it. I mean, it seems like when, even his second capture, or third capture, it's so hard with so many escapes. His third capture, his first capture, I think it's really interesting. Violence didn't go up after his first capture. And I think the message, there's a lot of theories behind the second capture back in, what was it, 13 or 14? Some people think that the Mexican government, that his capture was really the result of U.S. intervention, right? That U.S. agencies were key to his arrest, and that it was a surprise to high-level people in Mexico. And for those who were on the take, certainly, if you imagine that there were a couple of high-level people on the take, if they didn't know he was being captured, that was a real problem. And they needed to figure out a way to make things good with Chapo. And so his ability to maintain control of his operations and his ultimate ability to escape would be ensured by that. Now that's if you assume that there was high-level corruption inside the Mexican government.
Your whole point on poverty, Manuel López Obrador talks a lot about poverty amnesty for criminals. Do any of the candidates have a real plan in your view?
Well, other than López Obrador, it's not a central plank for any of the major candidates. And as far as I can tell, López Obrador's primary objective will be to promote and ensure redistribution of wealth. So it's going to be a fiscally driven solution to the problem, which would presumably tax more heavily Mexican private sector enterprises, but also individuals, and help to redirect that wealth to poorer people. And arguably, that is probably needed. I mean, Mexico has never had a responsible leftist party, a party that looks out for the social welfare of the poor. And this is the first time that may actually happen. I mean, you could say the PRI was that party back in the 40s and 50s, but under Lázaro Cárdenas. But arguably, it's been a long time since someone has actually promoted a social redistribution agenda in Mexico, and López Obrador seems to be very serious about that. Now, how effective he's going to be as president, without control of Congress, without experienced politicians running the bureaucracy, is you know, there's a lot of room to doubt that he's going to be successful. But redistribution of wealth is going to be part of it. What we don't hear a lot about, which I think is also important, is figuring out ways to actually make government services cost what they should cost. In terms of, for example, law enforcement. You know, your counterparts across the border are making maybe a quarter or a third of what you guys make as law enforcement officers. In Tijuana, I know it's about $1,800, $2,000 a month, which works out to not quite $30,000 a year to put your life at risk to protect people who don't have a lot of faith or confidence in you. And you don't hear anyone talking about actually raising salaries for police officers or investing more in law enforcement in ways that we have. I mean, I was saying to someone during the break, the average law enforcement officer doesn't have the kinds of opportunities and protections that you have. They don't have a good, number one, salary. They don't have decent educational opportunities or scholarships for law enforcement. They don't have a decent social security, they don't have decent medical coverage. They don't have decent pensions. If they get shot and killed on duty, their department won't even pay for their funeral, let alone benefits for the widows, right, or widowers. So, in my mind, yes, there needs to be social redistribution, and that's part of the challenges that we face, the problems of the poor. But there's also a question of building state capacity, government capacity to do a professional job. And if you don't pay police and treat police as professionals, you won't have professional policing. So there's the social side, but there's the state side that needs to be addressed. Yes, sorry.
Yeah, you spoke about the legalization of drugs.
Yeah.
I think about 20 to 25% of.
For marijuana legalization, probably.
But wasn't that totally, surpassed with them now using that?
Yeah, so the question is, if drug traffickers lost maybe as much as 20 to 25% of their revenues from marijuana, haven't they made that up through increasing meth and heroin? I don't know. The study that I mentioned is a study by RAND from 2009 that was conducted by Bo Kilmer and a couple of other very, I think, excellent researchers. And it was based on figures that were developed in the year or two before that. So we don't really know what drug proceeds look like today, and if someone wants to give Bo some more money, he could replicate that study, he could figure out what's happened to revenues. But what he said what their study said at that time was that even legalizing marijuana in California or a couple of major states in the United States would dramatically lower the price of marijuana to the point that it would not be of great value or revenue to Mexican organizations that were operating in that sphere. And as a result, those organizations have had to diversify and move into other areas. I don't think you can explain the heroin, you can blame a lot of the heroin crisis or the opioid crisis on bad doctors in the United States. But I think you also have to recognize that a part of the problem is that organized crime groups have had to diversify their operations and seek new markets. And so the other side of the equation is what's happening on this. The doctors explain the supply side. Drug trafficking organizations in Mexico explain what's going on the supply side. And they are looking to make money in the most profitable ways they can. So moving into opioids is one, moving into meth is another. With fentanyl, it's really restructuring and changing the industry. a colleague of mine at the University of Alabama named Chris Kyle, not the sniper, Chris Kyle, and I have been talking, and he's seeing a shift in the prices that are paid to opium farmers in the state of Guerrero. Prices are bottoming out, and these farmers are not, they're like, why should I be planting opium? Why are the prices bottoming out? Because fentanyl, with fentanyl, you don't need as much opium supply.
The overhead, the seals and.
And so you can just go straight to synthetics. So that's really going to be an interesting thing that, as June was talking about, is going to restructure the industry in unexpected ways. And then what do you do with all these farmers? What are the former opium smugglers, et cetera, going to be getting into next? It's hard to say.
Should we have one more question?
One more question. Please.
Your reports on extortion and kidnappings is showing a decrease. Could that possibly be because people do not trust the police?
To report. So you're saying that it could be that there's a reporting problem with the data. That's possible. I assume, I mean, you're talking, so extortion, you've got hundreds of cases. With kidnapping, you're talking about dozens of cases that are reported nationally. You get 100, on average, about 100 cases reported for the last 4 years. So those numbers are really low compared to the actual incidents in both cases. Absolutely, and that has absolutely to do with the low levels of confidence that people feel towards the criminal justice system. Something like 75% of crimes don't get reported, at least in Mexico, just because of that lack of confidence. It varies by crime, so it's conceivable that these rates are, 3, 4, maybe 5 times higher than they're actually studied. But the real question is, does the margin of error change a lot from year to year or month to month in terms of confidence levels? And I'm not sure that they do. People were arguably just as skeptical or fearful to report kidnappings here, and here, right? I don't know that your willingness to report crimes has changed that much from year to year. So one assumption that we can make is that what Mexicans call the cifra negra, the unknown number, remains relatively constant, or that the margin of error across these data are not hugely great from year to year. And if that's true, then these data are just as bad as these data, it's just as bad as these data. And we have to just interpret them with all of them with a big grain of salt. But assuming that grain of salt remains constant across all years, I do think it's totally plausible that extortion cases and kidnapping cases have gone down in these years in particular. Because you've taken, after this bulge, and a lot of this was Knights Templar. A lot of this was Zetas. And those are organizations that have effectively been dramatically reduced in capability. And groups like New Generation are still doing that kind of thing, but Sinaloa New Generation, they're smart, they're going for the big money. Kidnapping, extortion, these are messy crimes. They're easy to get caught for, things can go wrong, and frankly, the revenues are nothing close to the revenues you get from trafficking drugs. And those revenues are always going to be there, they're always going to be that high as long as there is a large and profitable black market for drugs here in the United States. And, I'll end on this note because it goes back to the question of legalization. Support for marijuana legalization, depending on what part of the country you live in, is around 60%, at least in the last polls that I've seen. There's a majority of Americans who believe that marijuana legalization is the course to go. Okay, but fine, if that only represents 20% of the proceeds, what are the levels of support for crack legalization? Those stand at around 1 in 20 people, about 5%, 5 to 7% for crack, meth, heroin, right? So we're a long ways away from a society that's going to be willing to legalize heroin and methamphetamine and crack and any other crazy drug that you can think up with synthetics.
Where were we 10 years ago on marijuana?
10 years ago on marijuana, we were at about 40, 45%. I remember because I raised the question in Washington, and there was that was when California voted in 2009, and we got about 44% of the vote in favor of marijuana. It failed, but then we got Colorado and other places. So we're a long way away. That may change depending on how we talk about the heroin crisis. Right? I mean, now you're seeing rich people's kids using drugs, and you know, the stigma that was applied to, say, African Americans or other minorities with regard to crack, they're not going to hold up when we're talking about the heroin crisis, the opioid crisis. And so it's conceivable to me that we can have an intelligent conversation about the most important question behind all these data, which is what's wrong with this country? What's wrong with the United States? Greatest country in the world, some of the highest levels of economic development in the world, land of opportunity, freedom, etc. Diverse, wonderful, love this country. But why are we so unhappy? Why are 1 in 5 people on antidepressants? Why are there so many people who are falling into opioid addiction? What is it about? Is it our culture? Is it the fact that some people are working 2 or 3 jobs at minimum wage to try to keep things afloat? Something's wrong. The opioid crisis is a symptom of some other larger problem. And frankly, I don't have a good answer for you. I don't know what that thing is. But we have not had a serious conversation about it. We have not talked about ways that we can help people deal with addiction and abuse. And it's a conversation that we need to have, and it shouldn't fall on your shoulders as law enforcement to help us, only to help us deal with that problem. That's the way I look at it. You guys are like the doctor, the last comment. You're like the doctor. Every day the doctor has a guy come in, and he's got a rat bite on his finger. He says, doctor, a rat bit my finger. You know, the doctor can stitch up that wound, right? Solve that problem right there, the damage that was caused. Guy goes home, gets bit by a rat, comes back the next day. Well, the doctor can stitch him up till the cows come home. What's the doctor going to do about the rat? Right? The source of the problem is beyond the scope of what law enforcement does. The scope of the problem is much bigger. It's a societal problem. It's a family problem. It's an education problem. And we have not marshaled, we've invested heavily in trying to make you guys, the doctors, as capable as you can be to fight this problem. But we're not doing anything about the rat. And we got to figure out what is the rat and how do we deal with it. So thank you very much.